want to welcome you to the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. This podcast is coming out of the Trauma Informed Educators Network Facebook group. I am so looking forward to talking to people globally about their trauma-informed journey. As the principal of Fall Hamilton Elementary School, a trauma-informed school in Nashville, Tennessee, I have learned that this is not a destination, and it truly is a process of learning and adjusting. So this podcast will be speaking to guests all over the world about people who are just starting their journeys and people have been on this journey for many, many years. So I hope you enjoy our guests. I hope you learned something just as I am. And welcome to the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. Hey, Eric, how are you? I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. How's it going in this interesting time?
Oh, I am hanging on. I have two daughters myself, and so, really just trying to keep up with the news, but separate myself from the news and create a good balance for that.
You know, it's important. There's a lot of information in every aspect, whether social media or TV, that's just being pushed out so quickly. And it's like you want to stay on the cusp and know what's going on. But at the same time, it can really be overwhelming. And I think that's something we need to talk about today, just kind of the bigger scope of these type of crises and things. But before we do that, the question I always ask is, tell us the Dr. Rossen story and tell us about you.
Happy to. I will start later on in my life because I don't think you want to hear all about my boring childhood in Long Island, New York. I am a school psychologist, and I started working as a school psychologist in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is a very large district right outside of Washington, D.C. There's both urban and suburban and even some rural components within that county, and a lot of transients within Washington, D.C. And so in my early years, in my first few years as a school psychologist, so this was 2006 through 2009 or so, I was getting referrals on a regular basis. And as part of that process, I was always trying to just build a rapport with the students that I was going to be working with. I'd be asking questions about, tell me about your weekends, tell me about your mornings, tell me about what happens after school, tell me about your family, some of the things that you're afraid of, some of the things that you love to do for fun. And in those conversations, I started to really be surprised at what students were revealing. And in many cases, I had a really hard time as a school psychologist reconciling what students were saying and identifying them as a student with a disability when I felt what we were seeing in school was not only potentially predictable based on their experiences, but almost an adaptive response, that they have adapted in a predictable way to their environment. But it was just incompatible with what we expected from them in the school setting. And so I really started to try and dig into this research a little bit. And at the time, we're talking 2007, 2008, the idea of trauma and its impact on students in the educational setting was really in its infancy. And there was nothing out there on this. And there really wasn't much when it came to psychological trauma for students outside of a very clinical sense and PTSD. Around that same time, a colleague of mine and I were asked to teach a graduate course at the University of Missouri Online for graduate counseling students on trauma. And we said, well, there's nothing out there. We couldn't find a book that we liked. So we said, let's work with these students and create a book that we think would be useful. Because many people in this course were practicing school counselors, some administrators. And through that process, I learned so much. And that was really my introduction to really getting into the research and the practical application of trauma-informed approaches. And it's really been such a journey for me. And I'm constantly listening to your podcast, which I both love and admire, and constantly reading and learning new things and building off of that, because this field continues to evolve. I think it's still in its infancy. but we finally do have a good foundation. It's it's made me what I believe to be a better educator, a better trainer, a better uh, parent, um, and I'm constantly aware, and it's constantly in the back of my mind.
Well, and I think that's, that is such a valid point, is that we're in an infancy. And I think right now lends itself some amazing times for us to dig deep on a big scale when we're talking about an international health crisis right now. We are talking about something that's impacting people. Literally, I spoke to my brother in Mongolia yesterday, they've been in their home since the 1st of February. I also spoke to my other brother in Taiwan, who there's only 10 cases, but they've locked down most everything. So we're talking global health crisis. So how do you see this work in this global scale?
Yeah, so this is unprecedented, and I guess maybe we should even say, for those that might be listening to this a year from now or 10 years from now, because of course this is going to be in the time capsule for eternity.
Of course, of course.
Of course, we're in the early stages of a global pandemic of coronavirus, COVID-19, and I think one of the biggest issues right now is the degree of uncertainty and lack of empowerment or control is can be so problematic for most people we know. I mean, lack of control we see as an issue for most people if you've ever been in traffic before. So let alone for children who maybe have a trauma history or a history of chronic stress. This can potentially be a serious trigger. So I think uncertainty is one big issue, and I think there's the potential for a lot of our students and just people in general to pick up on the fear of others that we usually look to for calm. So there's this concept of social referencing. Uh, it's think of when you look at a flight attendant on a plane when there's turbulence, and we're looking to others to know how to react and how to respond. And I think that's a big thing for adults to remember, is how are we regulating ourselves, because a lot of people, a lot of students are looking to certain individuals in their lives, whether it's leaders, whether it's their family, whether it's people on TV or our politicians, on are they calm, do they seem in control, are they panicking? Because if they're panicking, that means I need to be in a panic. And so I think uh, there's a real potential for people to pick up on that. But I think there's other there's other pieces that I think even in our communications, which I think are very well-meaning, uh, can be really hard for a lot of students. So we're telling people to go home, and for a lot, what does that mean for students that don't have a home? Or the idea about use this time to be with family. What about people who have a disrupted family life? What about people who've watched their parents be incarcerated recently? What about people who have not had a stable family for a long time? The idea about developing routines, and I keep seeing this in social media messaging, the importance of developing a routine. Well, disruption to the routine right now is so significant. And the idea of we don't know when we're going to go back to how things were can be so unnerving. So I think all this uncertainty and all these issues are on a global scale, when we can't even look to somewhere else and say, well, you know, they have it right and we're going to get it right, uh, can be really, really challenging.
Well, and I, kind of my train of thought when you're talking about, consistency in schedules, when assuming that people had consistency in schedules before, when we're talking about dysregulated families and families that are in crisis prior to this pandemic, this just adds a layer of intensity that wasn't there in an already intense situation. And I think about specific kids in my school who I know were in situations prior to us letting out over a week ago and going, they were already at the top of that intensity. Now layer this, and it just kills my heart. It aches and going, you know, what can we do? So let's talk about that. Like when we're talking about educators from afar, what can we do? I mean, what is there things that we look at, maybe those principles of a trauma informed, compassionate framework or something? What does that look like for us right now out of school? And even let's talk about what it's going to look like when we get back, because we will get back. And I think that's important for us to recognize, is that we will go back. It just takes time to get this to settle.
Sure. So I often reference these 6 principles of compassionate trauma-informed schools, which came out of Washington State. They're the Heart of Learning and Teaching, which is it's actually a free online book. And Washington State was really forward-thinking and progressive in the trauma-informed work. And I've been thinking about this and going through those 6 principles, how they apply in schools, but then how can you apply those principles, like you said, during this time? So one of the first of those is this principle of empower, never disempower. And the idea that we should always try to improve our students' sense of control and autonomy. And that need for control and autonomy increases as life becomes more unpredictable, like right now. So anyone who's ever spent time with young children or a toddler has found what happens when you are in an issue with empowerment, or dealing with trying to when you get into a power struggle when you're not empowering them. So I've been there with my toddler. Do you want to put your shoes on? No, they say. Well, here we are. We're now in a power struggle. Put your shoes on. So the best option, of course, is which pair of shoes do you want to put on? Which vegetable would you like to have for dinner? Now, the research demonstrates that actually improving a student's perceived ability to shape their environment or locus of control improves their perceived ability to cope with adversity. And we know that power struggles are often opportunities for students to feel in control. The more helpless and dependent and incompetent someone feels, the worse their symptoms will become. So, I've given an example in school of which is based on a real example about a 10th grader that walked into a class with a hat on, and there was a no hat policy in that school, and the teacher said, take your hat off, and the students said no, and all the students were settling in, and suddenly there's this public power struggle, right? So how do you get out of this? Do you exercise your authority and say take it off or else? And if they still say no, you're either, as a teacher, you're embarrassed. If you let it go, you lose your sense of authority. Now, what this teacher ended up doing was giving them several options, but also they talked to them first. They said, okay, class, why don't you get started? Mike, can you please come up here and talk to me? And they talked to the student, and they turns out that it was actually their foster brother's hat, who was actually just placed somewhere else, and it was something that was reminding them of him. So they said, okay, here's a few options, because there is a no hat policy. I can keep it in my classroom. You can choose where you keep it. You can put it in your drawer. I'll give you a pass to put it in your locker right now. Or we can leave it in the principal's office for safekeeping till the end of the day. That's totally up to you. Which of those options works best? And so they listened, and they were compassionate, and they empowered that student. So how does this work now? Now, one thing I saw actually on the Trauma Informed Educators Facebook page was a post from Heather Olson, who actually was talking about the language we're using right now that might feel disempowering. The idea that you're trapped at home, the idea that you're stuck, the idea that you're forced to stay home. So thinking about the language we're using, that can be very disempowering. The idea that you have zero choice in your environment. You have no locus of control. Empowering students to focus on different steps they can take to stay safe. You want to give them choices around how to structure the day. So if you are saying, well, reading is important, you must do reading. When would you like to do reading? Would you rather do reading in the morning or the afternoon? Would you like to have it after snack or before lunch? How can you indicate when you need a break? How do you indicate your readiness for learning? When do you think you learn best? So trying to find opportunities to give choices. You can also empower them in ways by giving them prompts like, I feel blank, I need blank, I want to know more about blank, and uh, prompting them to not only ask questions, but advocate for what they think they need.
I love that choice piece, and I give my boys the choice of quiet time before lunch or quiet time after lunch. But either way, we do take about an hour, and I tell them, I don't. You can go read, you can go do a puzzle, you can do, but we're going to take this time. And how empowering! And they actually, I've noticed, they don't think I noticed, but they actually are enjoying it, the time to just kind of decompress. I even took a picture of my middle son sitting on the back patio reading, and that was his choice. And I think that's so important. And I love your stems, because we need to have those conversations with our kids, and even our educators can have those conversations if they have the opportunity. How are you feeling? Even our families, I think that's so important. And you've brought up so many valid points of in this global piece, and I think we can see the transition down to what does that mean for educators when they go back to school, but how do you translate that to a day-to-day in a school? And I think one message that I constantly give my teachers that I work with is that consistency and predictability are the two most powerful tools you can build within your classroom. Obviously, relationships being number one, but when you're talking about structures. So talk a little bit about that, because it sounds like what you were talking about. And then also, how does that empower kids?
Uh, well, you want to, structure is really critical. And I think the idea is that you're building choice within an existing structure. So there's a predictability, there's a framework, there's this schema, this idea that you know what you're going into. Any we rely on routines, we rely on a predictability of our environment. If anyone has been driving to work and suddenly the way you go to work, there's construction, you have to take a detour, suddenly like there's this panic setting in. So the idea is like kind of like what you were saying, Matt, is you said quiet time is a part of the structure of our day, but there's choice in how that happens and what you do with it and when it occurs. But it's going to happen because that's an important foundation for our life here, for our schedule, for our daily functioning. So there's this really there's this sweet spot of balance between rigidity and flexibility.
Yes. I think I always have lived on that verge of no rigidity and more on the flexibility.
Yeah.
And my wife is more on the rigidity side, which I tell people all the time, she's what keeps me alive. I, I mean, she makes me, we wash our hands every time I come in. And it is important. There has to be that balance of boundaries versus kids do whatever they want. And I think that's a conversation that is happening right now in this movement, that there has to be candid conversations with educators and practitioners, that when we talk about trauma informed, we're not talking about kids do whatever they want because they've had a traumatized experience,
Right.
whether big T or little t or any trauma. Talk about that, because that is a subject right now that we have to have conversations around.
Yeah. Well, God, this reminds me of a story where I was presenting in a room of um, it was uniformed officers, and some of them were school resource officers, and I have the utmost respect for school resource officers. And there are many that are really attuned to kids' needs and are a great resource to schools. But there were a few people in this room, and they were again they were in this professional development with other teachers and counselors and school psychologists, um, and they were in their full blues. Some of them had bulletproof vests on, guns and holsters, and and one of them raised their hand after I was talking for a while and introducing some of this. And this was back in like 2011. So again, this was early on. And he said, well, aren't we just enabling these kids and allowing them to do what they want? And they're just going to end up in the back of my patrol car when they're 18. And then I tried to address that. And then another one said, well, fine. Let's say hypothetically a kid has had a history of sexual abuse. That's awful. I get that. But the rules are the rules. And I remember I was sort of stunned, and I kind of froze for a minute because I really didn't know how to respond to that. Um, and again, there's this sometimes this idea that compassion means no rules. That compassion means that um, there's that the rules don't apply, that they have a different set of expectations, and that's just not true. Um, but finding that balance of being compassionate and employing some flexibility within the structures that we've set um, is hard. It's hard to do, and it takes a lot of thought and time and trial and error. And I screw up as a parent all the time with it, and
Yes.
then I try to fix it, and then the next issue comes up, and I get it wrong, and then I eventually get it right. Sometimes.
And I think that's the power. And I have a friend, Alex, who always says embrace the mess. And it is that. It's that, what I think holds us back is that a lot of people back, and it holds me back sometimes, is the fear of it's not going to work, so we just can't, right? And it is that compassion. And even the story you just shared about the student with the hat, that's a boundary. That's a healthy boundary. Yes, it is a rule. And it's ironic because I have a kid that wears a hat in my school he wears a hat. That's what he needs. It's okay. But anyway, but it's it's not even a compromise. It's choice. Here, this is the expectation. Here's your 3 different choices. I'm going to support you in whatever choice you make, and we're going to make this happen, as opposed to take your hat off because I said it, right? That's, I think, the difference. And that story just laid out the idea of boundary and empowerment perfectly. And I think
Yeah.
that's what we're talking about.
Yes. My mother was a high school math teacher, and there was a saying that went around in her school. I don't know if you've heard it. Don't smile until Christmas.
Yes.
It's this, I guess, a well-known saying of this idea that if you let on that you actually um, have some interest in having a relationship with the students, then you will lose control of the classroom. Um, and I've challenged her as any good son would to his mother on that on that concept. So I certainly don't subscribe to that. But I think there's also just the challenge, and I'm aware of the fact that a lot of times we have educators that have their own upbringing, that they have how they were raised, how they went to school, and they're applying what they know. And so um, people will be in different places in their ability to do this. Um, so anyway, I think that first principle of empower and never disempower is one of the most really critical ones of those 6.
So yeah, I mean, let's dig in even a little further into some of those 6.
Yeah.
And again, kind of pulling back on a greater scale and looking at a big picture right now, again, in the state that we're in. How do you see the connection to some of the other principles that you ground your work in?
Yeah. So the second principle is unconditional positive regard, and this kind of goes at what we were just talking about. Unconditional positive regard doesn't mean that you are not human or you don't react or have emotions. Instead, it demonstrates that even in periods where you're angry or you're frustrated or disappointed, you still care, you still respect, and you still have the best interests of the student in mind. And so there's this trust component. And I tell this story pretty regularly of unconditional positive regard, of a teacher who was working with a student who was in first grade, and this student was throwing chairs, biting other kids, spitting, highly dysregulated, was regularly getting kicked out of the classroom. And uh, the school psychologist worked with that teacher, and when that kid came back to class, they created a card to leave on the student's desk that some other student signed, and it just said, "Welcome back, we missed you." And what that communicated was very powerful. It communicated that even though we didn't approve of what you did, we approve of you. You're a part of this classroom, you're part of this community, you belong here. And the school actually started developing welcome back cards as a part of a reentry process, that they know that when they come back, there will be a card waiting for them that basically says, "We're glad to have you back." And I find that so powerful. So the idea of unconditional positive regard, uh, for, you know, how do you share that now when you're away from your students? So for um, one thing we've seen uh, is the potential for stigma and prejudice associated with COVID-19 right now. There's some evidence of students of Chinese or Asian descent actually receiving prejudice or stigma, um, both in the news, not to get political, but also um, there's evidence of that at a local level. There's even, I was reading something about how there's some takeout places that have had less business as a result of, um, the ownership. And so, you know, thinking that, how do we remind students and communicate with them that racism and bias have no place here? If someone in our class is sick, we will rally around them. We are not going to stigmatize them, because even if they're sick, even if even if we're afraid about what might happen, they're still part of our community and we support them.
Well, it's interesting because I think back to my own childhood when HIV had just first kind of hit the scene and really going into that pandemic and even epidemic kind of status of there was a little boy in my hometown who tested positive for HIV. And I can still remember so clearly this uproar of him attending school, and he was elementary school. And I mean, it was massive. And so even things in those type of situations where the stigma, and yes, the child did have this infectious disease, and yes, there was not a lot of information about it, but even after the information came out and it was clear that this wasn't going to be transmitted, people were still so up in arms. And I think
Yeah.
it goes to what you're saying now, and even narrowing it down to a classroom where it's the same kid. Let's be honest, let's talk about the stinking those clip charts, right? It's the same kids that are having a hard time. And
Yes.
it's how do we not stigmatize them and do what you just said? And what you talked about was the restorative process, and we use that in my school. And one of the things I love to do on a reentry, when a kid, not we don't suspend kids, but when a kid has been out of the room for a bit, we have them come back in, is have the kids say something affirming to the kid that came in, and then how they have that child's back. And you can see the kid go, oh, like they
Yes.
do still care about
Just
me.
this relief. Sure. And not to put you on the spot, but I'm curious if you can recall back to the student you were talking about that tested HIV positive. In hindsight, based on your experience compared to what you know now, what were the things that were done incorrectly in that situation?
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
both from
Yeah.
whether there was fear from you as a student that was unjustified or irrational, um, So it's hard to reflect back, knowing everything that was said. But I'm just curious. Sorry to turn the tables, but
No, hey, I love to talk, so that's not a problem. And it's interesting because the child didn't actually go to my school. It was a local school in my area, but it wasn't my school. And I can still remember as being a kid thinking what it must be like to be this kid. Like, I mean, the news, it's same thing, the news, it was all over the news, and there were parents picketing, and I just can't. I think everything was all wrong. I mean, I
yeah,
don't know if anything was done correctly. And it honestly makes me want to go back and research and find this little boy as an adult and say, hey, man, like I remember when this happened, and hope he's still here, that maybe we can have a conversation. Because I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't remember anything sounding correct to me as a child. So I can only imagine with what I have now in understanding the brain science behind trauma, what I would think now.
yeah. Well, it probably goes back to that social referencing, right? Like you had no reason to be afraid, but if you saw the adults were afraid, you said, well, maybe I need to be afraid.
And I think that's so important, and that is that oh man, there is a neuroscience term, mirrored something or other. I'm not a neuroscientist, right? I'm a principal. So, but it is that, and I when I speak, I show a picture of my own child dressed up like me for Halloween. It wasn't my idea; it was his. But I use that
Sure.
perspective. He watches everything that I do. And kids at school watch everything that I do. They watch how I interact with their parent, with a peer, with a teacher. And they watch educators, everything they do. And they watch right now in this crisis, they watch in parents and how they are responding. So I think, as we've looked at a global all the way down to the classroom, it's all interconnected. These
Yes,
principles are core
they are.
to the day to day.
They are. So, ways to, whether, so the idea is what can they do now? And if teachers have any contact with their students, um, it's this idea of sharing this sense of community, this sense of, I don't care what's gone on up to this point. Um, we're part of a community, we're a small community within a larger community, we're our classroom within our school, within our within our grade, within our school, within our district, within our county, right? And these concentric circles of belonging. And I think that's an important thing to keep delivering, because you know I was taking a hike, and I was 6 feet away from this other psychologist friend of mine, and we were talking about the impact of lack of social connection and the long-term impacts of that for people during this period. So even just creating a sense that I'm still part of something, I think is really important.
I agree. And isn't it interesting that you see now these major companies getting on board with, like, Netflix is doing Friend movie
Mm,
virtually? Like, we know the impact of connection. I mean, this has really brought a giant lens to the power and impact of connection in people's need, to where companies are now trying to figure out how do we get people to connect
yes,
during this time of disconnection. And
right.
yet, will it drive systematic change? Will it identify that, wow, schools are hubs for these type of very important connections?
Yes,
Communities need it. I just wonder that, and
yes,
I think
I
that goes to
agree.
principals.
I agree. And as a parent of children in public school, the school provides a social network for me as a parent. And so 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 I think that's a second principle of unconditional positive regard. But I think there's a broader piece within that, as far as um, that community and sense of belonging. um, so I'll jump to the third principle, uh, is this idea of maintaining high expectations. And again, these principles are broadly applied, so they were designed prior to any pandemic. um, and this is the idea that, and again, bringing back to the conversation we had earlier, that children with a trauma history sometimes are viewed as less capable than their peers, um, and that compassion does not translate to lower expectations. And there is plenty of research to show that expectations actually influence outcomes. Uh, I'll share this brief research study with rats that I talk about sometimes. There was a study with rats, and they gave them to college students, and they gave one set of they randomly assigned some students to the stupid rats and one to the smart rats, and said, here's a standardized way to teach them to go through a maze. And a spoiler alert that there are no stupid rats and smart rats, right? They were all just rats.
Yep.
And the ones that were given the, quote, smart rats went through the maze significantly faster. That the idea of just planting the expectation that they were stupid, even with a standardized protocol to teach going through the maze, impacted how those people worked with the rats. Anyway, it's an interesting study, and I think the idea is that our expectations matter, and making sure that students know that we still have expectations for them, even when they're not in school, is still important. So you had shared, for anyone that isn't part of the Trauma Informed Educators Facebook page, I highly recommend joining it. And Matt, as what I view you to be as among the most forward-thinking principals I've ever seen, shared a letter you had sent um, to your community, and it basically set expectations. The expectations are still high, but they were diverted away from academic functioning purely, more about, we have expectations for your health behaviors. We have expectations for taking care of yourself and taking care of others. We have expectations that you will be thoughtful and of other people, and the impact that if you sneeze, it may make other people sick, even if you don't get sick. We have expectations around your kindness. We have expectations that you're going to be willing to do your best. We have expectations that you're going to be flexible. And we have expectations that you're going to ask questions if you have them, whether they're questions that you need help, or questions about clarification of what's happening, or questions about a general concern. There's still expectations. Um, and so even expectations about what will stay the same. We expect you to maintain your relationships, your love for your family, your desire to learn, whatever. So I thought your letter really captured the idea that expectations may change, but they're still high. We expect a lot from you because we think you're that great.
And I think that's important, is that, first of all, I want you to share that rat study with me, because I think it's so important. But I think that's it, and I think and I don't know who did the quote, or I would give them credit, but it's, when you see kids differently, you see different kids. And it is that important, when we're talking about working, especially those who are working in marginalized communities. And if we don't take into account bias and perspective and those type of pieces, we're missing some major integral part of this trauma-informed work. It's not just about big T trauma anymore. We're really digging into societal and systematic issues that are impacting us as educators, with the interactions of our kids. And so I think that's really important that we look at it that way.
I agree. So I'll jump into the fourth principle, which is check assumptions, observe, and listen, right? And this is, seems pretty obvious. The best part is all these principles seem pretty obvious, but they're just packaged in a very rational way for me. And we often make assumptions about who will be affected by adversity or stress, or how much people will be affected, or what their response should look like, or what's causing a certain behavior. And so it's the idea that we're just replacing our assumptions with observations and questions. So sometimes we might assume that a lack of change in behavior means that someone's not affected by something that happened to them. And so instead, we want to just shift that to be observing and even question. I noticed you haven't mentioned anything about Coach Taylor passing away. I know it's been a few years since he was your coach, but how are you feeling? Are you okay? So it's a pretty simple concept of uh, of really realizing that many times we're making assumptions, we're filling in gaps of information based on beliefs that we're not verifying.
And I don't know if you know, my school's a Leader in Me school, so we teach the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and I'm a huge Stephen Covey fan. And that is habit 5: seek first to
Yep.
understand, then to be understood. And it really is, to me, it's the foundation of all trauma informed work. It's, why is this? What is this response? How is this impacting? Before I try to formulate what I'm going to do or how I'm going to fix the behavior or whatever, I have to get to what's the core. And I my wife says I struggle with seek first to understand, then to be understood, because so many times I'm just.
Well, then it is the truth.
It is in a lot of my ways. I need to step back and see a bigger picture. But at school, it's a place I feel like I do it well, and I think it's, even right now in the state that we're in when we're talking about this global issue, really we got to step back again, and sometimes we just have to be silent in the space, figure out the whole big picture before we're formulating a response. And I think that if some of our leaders, and I'm not getting political at all, and I'm not even talking about on a national scale, but even on a local scale, we've got a bunch going on here where there's responses coming out and there's no seeking first to understand. It's lashing out, and it's people. And what you said, it goes back to that first principle of looking at us and negotiating how we respond. And it really is creating this huge problem. And that happens in classrooms every single day, where as educators, we're responding without seeking first to understand or without getting to the core. And it's creating this gap between us and those whom we're serving and working with.
Yes. And I think there's this fear sometimes to ask questions or ask students how they're doing or ask families how they're doing. And I sometimes do this quick poll if I'm ever doing a presentation with educators, and I say, all right, how many of you think that asking a student if they've thought about hurting themselves or killing themselves will actually put them at higher risk for suicide or trigger them in some way? And many say yes, and the answer is no. Asking someone how they're doing, uh, if the answer is yes, it's going to feel like a huge relief. If they haven't been, they're not going to say, "Huh, now that you mention it, I will." No, they'll always just say, "No, I haven't."
And it's,
Similarly, asking. Oh, God.
no, it just brought me back, and I'm going to get kind of, I don't know, candid here, but it reminds me of when I grew up. I grew up in a very conservative home, and we didn't talk about sex. Like, don't talk about it because then they'll figure it out and then they'll want to do it. Like, it's that same thing, right? It's
Yes,
like,
exactly.
don't
Put them in
mention,
the bathroom. Yep.
yeah, don't mention some of these things because then they'll start thinking about it. But we know that isn't the case.
Yes,
Um,
and it's the same with trauma. If you ask them, have you been struggling? Are you having a difficult time? Um, you know, Suddenly asking that is not going to suddenly put a student in a tailspin. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that asking good questions and avoiding making assumptions is helpful to students and almost never harmful. So I'll jump into the fifth principle, which is relationship coaching, and the idea of that students, personally, I think adults need a lot of relationship coaching. We're constantly working on relationships, and these are skills that can be explicitly taught. Um, Adults need to model how to interact with others. There's research that shows that how teachers act towards the kids with externalizing problems impacts how other kids react to those same kids. So there's other research that's found that students report better coping skills when they perceive teachers as being caring and supportive to the other teachers. So the idea of we see ourselves as relationship coaches is really important. So what are some things that kids can use relationship coaching on? And I talk a lot about, I always ask, and people say, oh, thanking others, listening, whether it's participating in an interview. I always say the things that most people need relationship coaching on is how to like authentically apologize. And I always say that's a hard thing for me. And so what do students, during this COVID and everything's closed, what kind of relationship coaching can we provide? Well, how do you maintain relationships without seeing your friends every day? I think we all know what it's like to have grown up with friends or be part of something where you're seeing people on every day. And so you don't have to plan anything. It's just kind of this organic relationship building. And then suddenly those structures are gone. You're part of a team and you see each other in practice, and then the team disbands, right? How do you maintain those relationships? How do you talk on the phone? A lot of kids don't know how to talk on the phone. How do you check in on older family members? How do you actually have a conversation with someone who's 2 generations apart from you? So there are ways that we can build in coaching on how to maintain a relationship. Um, Now I'll share something that a good friend of mine and I were talking about, and he was talking about how he trains customer service people in the hotel industry. And when he was talking, of course, I said, "Oh, this is so interesting," because he is applying to schools. He talked about different communications. Some are transactional and some are engaging as far as our interactions go. So he said, interactional, think Chipotle. You walk up and they say, bowl or burrito. And then you move down, black beans or pinto beans, brown rice or white rice. This is transactional. It's designed for efficiency. It's information for the purpose of a transaction versus engaging. And he says, think Chick-fil-A. He says they bring it to your table, they talk to you, they ask how you're doing, they ask if you need anything else. And it's engaging and it's designed for connection, but a transaction still occurs. And as he was talking, I immediately thought, okay, I remember being on bus duty, and there's a difference between, there's a transaction that's occurring. Get inside, get off the bus, get your stuff, get in the building. And there were people who had a transactional engagement with the kids, and there were people who had a transactional interaction. Other people had an engaging interaction with them. Those kids still got inside, but it was good morning. And I think about when I drop my kids off, I live close enough where I drop them off. The person who always opens the car door, some of them will say, "Oh my God, I love your shoes. I wish I had a pair just like them. Why don't you use those shoes to run fast up the pathway and get in there?" And they say the kids by name. And so just teaching that interactions are not all the same.
I don't know if I've ever heard that interactional versus or transactional versus engage.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever heard that, but wow. I mean, so true. And I don't know if you've seen, there was a viral video that I don't even remember. It was I think it was a school for speech or something. I don't remember. That basically lined that out. A kid that got on the bus versus a transactional interaction versus an engaging interaction. When they went into the school, a transactional versus an engaging. But man, that is powerful stuff right there. And I think transactional interactions that educators give versus the engaging, it's very obvious. And the classroom culture, you can feel the difference between a transaction and an engagement. And I think a lot of times what we say is we need to increase engagement in student voice. What we're really saying is we need to increase engagement interactions.
Correct.
So yes. Powerful. Man,
yes.
I feel like there's a t-shirt coming out of this conversation.
Yeah, bumper stickers, everything. It's
yes,
the whole thing. And there's this quote when it comes back to like this idea of like relationship coaching and like teaching the skills. There's this quote from the Harvard Center on Developing Child, and it says, "Resilience requires relationships, not rugged individualism." And I always share that because it actually it's one of my big issues with this concept of grit. So both from a research perspective that it's not really like a measurable solid construct, but the idea of when I hear grit, I think that it's this concept that it's the individual's responsibility and obligation to solely get through something versus the idea that there are environmental variables that need to rally around this individual to create protective factors that enable them to be resilient and recover. And relationships is a critical one. And knowing how to maintain relationships is a skill. And without it, um, you can't expect all kids to just know how to maintain relationships. Some of them need to be taught explicitly.
And I think too, understanding that they may not have experienced a healthy relationship. And
Oh yeah,
so their model and being a foster parent and having students or children that have been through trauma, I've learned that their interactions, one of my boys, he just seeks so much negative interaction, and he'll even say, I did it because I wanted you to, like, he knows. But that is a learned behavior
yes,
that we have to reteach appropriate interactions and appropriate connections. And it is just so interesting that we assume that kids come in with those skills. And there was even some legislation against antisocial and emotional learning in the state of Tennessee by Representative Butts, ironically by the name, because she said that that should happen at home and in church. And I think that is such a perception that is so misguided. And I
yeah.
think it goes right into the classroom.
I couldn't agree with you more, and disagree with your state legislator. Couldn't disagree with them more. Um, there's this great activity I want to share that I've seen schools do. They would gather school staff on a non-student day. They would have a list of every student, and each staff member would go through and put a mark next to the student that they felt like they had a good relationship with, and they would identify the students that had no marks next to them. And they would say, these are students that one adult in the building needs to actually connect with, um, because right now they have no strong adult interactions, um, and we don't know what's happening.
And I
So
wouldn't be shocked if it wasn't the kids who weren't in trouble,
correct. Yes.
because that's what I've noticed. And I did a 5 positive phone call home challenge. I sent it out on social media, and there were
Yeah,
a
I saw
lot of
it. I loved it.
administrators.
I loved it.
And I tell you, I was calling parents who I had never really called before, other than interactions in the morning drop off because I'm out there every morning. But they would cry, and I thought it was so interesting that they would all go, "Uh-oh, like, why are you calling?" And I would say, "Just to tell you, your kid's awesome." And I could hear, I could feel the confusion over the phone. Um,
Yes.
and I think that's the power of, and again, going back to how kids respond to trauma looks differently. And when I speak nationally, internationally, I always ask the question of what do children who have experienced trauma look, feel like, and sound like in your school? I've never, ever had anybody say humorous or perfectionism. But I always bring those two things up because a lot of times kids are utilizing these coping skills that are camouflaging what's really happening. So I, I, I get it, and I hear you, and it's important, and we've got to know the kids who are what I call our camo kids that blend in.
Oh yeah, I like that term. And what you were saying, just like, being sure that there's a balance of positive and negative. I think about this saying that I always share. This is something that my grandma always said. She said, "Pain shared is halved, joy shared is doubled." And the idea that being around people accentuates joy and reduces pain, and that teaching students to build their networks, and what you're doing is sharing in the joys and the positive experiences. So I think teaching that strong balance is really critical. So relationship coaching is that fifth principle, and then we get to the last one, which is providing opportunities to assist. Uh, and this is based on the fact that the feeling that impacts students with the trauma history a lot is helplessness. And so helping others can really mitigate that. So helping others improves feelings of self-worth, connectedness, recovery. So there's lots of ways to do that. Reading students in lower grades, tree planting, safety patrol, running errands. There's this website. I haven't checked in a while, but I used to use it sometimes. It's called freerice.com. And I don't know if you've heard of it, but
No, I
basically
haven't.
there's all these different grade levels, and it asks multiple choice questions on a range of different topics: math, reading, history, whatever. And every question you get right donates 10 grains of rice to an impoverished area of the world. And you see the grains of rice building up. So it's like educational, but it's a sense of like giving back. Um, and so, within that principle, I've been thinking too, like, how can you assist others? And how can, even at home, how can you create structured ways to help people from afar while still being safe? Whether you're helping to deliver food or essentials to the elderly, maybe you're just helping cook dinner at home one night, or you're offering to help with the dishes because parents are probably just as stressed, if not more so. Um, so, and I was curious from your perspective, Matt. Have you seen? I know you went through a tornado pretty recently, and you've shared on social media some of the experience of helping others and kind of what that does to you personally. Um, so, and I don't know if any of your students got involved in that either.
Yeah, and so, again, going back to saying we're a leader in me school, and this is what we refer to as identifying every kid's genius, because they all have genius. Every single kid has genius. It's figuring out what that is and empowering them through that, and building on their skill set. And I think that I'm not a what's it called, man? I don't know, something Graham, where they identify the number, but everybody always tells me you're this number of Enneagram. I don't know what it's called anyway, but it is a giving, right? And I think when we empower kids to give, even my own kids, and when we empower our kids to take on responsibility that they can handle, and even sometimes when they think they can't handle it, and then they do handle it, it's so empowering. And that's for all three of my boys. And that's for every kid in my school. We have jobs, actually jobs that are posted that kids apply and interview for. And it's some of our hard kids. And what I've learned is some of our hardest kids excel the most when given the biggest responsibilities, because that is resiliency, that is impacting. And I know some of our kids did get involved in the relief work by collecting food or helping. Of course, the city was saying don't bring kids down to the tornado site because it's dangerous. But I did see some of my families on social media um, helping. And I think it's important, even now during this time, that our kids have some sort of connection to helping. And in our daily school lives, when we get back to that, kids need to feel like they're a part of something and are helping.
Yeah.
It's so important.
And I mean, whether educators can think about ways that they can be helpful, right? Maybe it's mowing the lawn of their elderly, for the elderly neighbor one day, or again, you want to do things that don't put them at risk or harm's way, or make them uncomfortable, or just say, create a challenge, a social media challenge with your students. How can you help others, and put it on them. A lot of times, I speak from personal experience. Kids are way more creative than me, so utilize their collective genius.
I'm sure they're TikToking right now and impacting everybody. Excuse me, everybody. I've seen educators on TikTok. I'm on that cusp of being too old. Am entertained by it for others, but myself, I
Yes,
can't do it.
I did try to download it. Well, I didn't download it. I'm I have full capability of downloading things.
Yeah.
I attempted to play with it for a few minutes and gave up. So it's still like, one day, along with like learning Spanish, like it's going to happen at some point in the future. Um, but I think within all of this, I think we'd be remiss to not address this last piece of self-care. And I know um, there is this. We talk about self-care a lot, um, and I'm rejuvenated and really glad that self-care is regularly in the conversation and often come up. I think now more than ever is when we need to think about self-care in a very broad sense. Because a lot of times I've seen self-care and people are just like, oh, like here's like the shot of my legs and my margarita and or, I'm in the bath or I'm getting a massage. But it's not just like pampering yourself, right? It's this idea of thinking about your financial health, because right now finances could be really concerning for people. Thinking about your physical health. A lot of people are at home. They may, we were talking about this. You may not get out of your pajamas for 5 days at a time. You
Yeah.
may not, you may lose your sense of your daily rhythms and these cycles that force you to actually like, this is when I come down, then I get dressed, I take a shower, your emotional health, your social networks, and then balancing that with like freeing yourself from certain burdens that aren't urgent. I think this idea that self-care is a mindset, and it needs to be purposeful and habit forming. It's not just I'm going to pick one day and do something, but it's a habit. That you're not glamorizing this perception of busyness. You're identifying what nurtures you. You convince yourself that you need it and you deserve it.
And I think that's important in the 7 habits. It's habit number 7, sharpen your saw. And I think what you said is really important in that, and what I've noticed in education, and we are underpaid, we are undervalued, but sometimes we get a sense of being a martyr, and we have to drive ourselves into the dirt, and we've got to fight for, and we've got to be really cautious on that, because it's not sustainable. It's not doable. It's
Yes.
not, we have to take this self-care thing. And I'm preaching to myself right now. I'm probably doing self-talk and don't even realize it. But it's important that all of us, from administrators, district office, to classroom teachers, to paraprofessionals, to the cafeteria staff, to our bus drivers, because at the end of the day, we're impacting kids on a daily basis. And if we're on the verge of only having transactional interactions with our kids because we're so exhausted, overwhelmed, and
Yeah.
it doesn't work. So the last question, Dr. Rossen, that I have for you is the one that I ask everybody. And it is, what do you want to leave with educators? What do you want them to know about their work, their impact, and from your perspective? What do you want them to know?
Well, to know, for one, know that I admire and respect and appreciate anyone that sets foot in a classroom, and I'm so thankful. I think it's easy for me, and probably anyone that's ever like presented to staff, to talk about things that should be done and the ways that things should be done, and potentially criticize even constructively what's happening. Um, but I think it's harder to acknowledge all the things that you're doing right, and all the instincts that you have that are already filled with that compassion we need when working with students with trauma histories. And so I want to leave with the idea that I think most teachers I know are doing some amazing things already by instinct without even having to think about it. It's automatic. It's built into who they are as a professional. And so I want to leave with, for most, follow your instincts, and some of these tools you know are hopefully designed to just sharpen the what you're doing already. um, Build in one thing if you can, anything that sticks with you. um, and again, I just think the idea of taking care of yourself, maintaining relationships, um, knowing and being able to regulate and know when you need a break from all this and to free yourself from burdens is going to be really critical.
I mean, I think we could talk for another 2 hours, but I appreciate your perspective. I appreciate your focus, and I appreciate your contribution, because you've written books and articles. And is your book already out, or is it coming out?
So I have one book that it's the second edition of The title is Supporting and Educating Traumatized Students, a Guide for School-Based Professionals. It's an edited book that just came out in February from Oxford University Press. And that book covers, among it, so for one, it's an edited book, meaning you have chapter contributions from a range of people. Deals a lot with kind of looking through trauma through a cultural lens, and it looks at a range of different potential sources of trauma and strategies to support those students that any educator can provide. So one example is, like I always share, like if you have a student with an incarcerated caregiver, we put in there, you can spend time helping that student prepare for the first visit, right? What are they going to be wearing? What should they wear? Are they going to be able to hug the person? How long is that visit going to be? Take a look at a picture of the prison online so you know what you're walking into. So just general strategies that don't require a mental health degree. And then it goes into kind of the broader implementation pieces, trauma screening. And one of my favorite chapters in that book is this chapter. A couple architects are actually the trauma-informed design of a school and the actual physical elements of a school that are kind of trauma-informed. So that's one. And then I have another book coming out with with a co-author, Dr. David Bateman, who's a special education professor, on trauma-informed IEPs and applying a trauma-informed process to IEP and 504 development. That's a short book. It's like 80 pages. It's from LRP Publications. And it's designed to be like kind of a quick read and just an application of this process, application of trauma-informed approaches to the IEP process, everything from the IEP meetings to family engagement to report writing to design of present levels and IEP goals and things like that.
And that I could get on a policy platform of talking about the impacts of trauma and IEPs and anyway, but I really appreciate you and your contribution to this work and through your books and your writing and your voice that's backing it, because it's imperative. So if people want to follow you on your social media, which I would highly recommend because you are producing some amazing things, where would they find you?
Sure. Well, I have a website. It's ericrossen.com, ERICROSSEN.com. My Twitter is at @E_Rossen. And I'm on Facebook too. So, and while I have the floor, I want to just extend my gratitude to you, Matt, for your incredible work. I think you're inspiring and thoughtful and incredibly organized. And what you've done to bring people together and network has helped me professionally and personally. I've connected with people through the Facebook group that you have designed. So if you follow me, you should follow Matt. Please contact and connect with me anytime.
I really appreciate that. And I'm glad I give you this perception of organization, because my staff and my wife would probably tell you otherwise. Although I do have I know where everything is in every stack that's all over my office. But anyway, yes, I hope that everybody joins, if you have not, the Trauma Informed Educators Network on Facebook. Also look for our conference, which we have not postponed yet. We are just going to wait to see the timeline because it is in mid-July. It's July 20 to 21st. It's in Nashville. We have presenters from international places. We also have them from all over the state. Right now, there's 27 different states represented in participation. So you can look at that on the Trauma Informed Educators Network Conference on Eventbrite. But and if you do so need to or have the desire to follow me, it is at Principalist on Instagram and also on Twitter. And it's just my name on Facebook. Matthew with 1T Portel. So thank you so much. And thank you all for listening to the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast.